we go. Now you can find it on YouTube if I can ever get back up. My computer that I used to do it, it's having issues, so I may have to do something about that. And it's fell asleep. All right, here we are. We're in John, session 25. Come on, let's get to the good stuff, right? I'll just make this remark. I promised you. Oh, come on, go to the right place. On your notes, the previous proof conclusions. So I thought this would be a great place, although remember the breaks are all added. So, we didn't get versification. We did get chapters in around 600, 800 AD. We didn't get versification until after that. So where they break it, there is no punctuation in Greek. There is no other things. So our translators, not so much our translators, those who are looking at the text and trying to make it easier for us to understand the pieces, right? They had to figure out where the sentences, where the thoughts end. We try to look at it in a bigger picture standpoint, so we try to ignore any of the, well, it's hard to ignore. I don't call them verses, I call them statements, but it's hard to ignore where they have picked in the past to do it. We try to find the true places. This is not bad, because you're going to find that when we get finished with the first chapter, the second chapter goes into the wedding at Cana. So we're going to finish with the disciples right now, and then we get into Cana. So I figured this was a good place to give you, again, the logos to telos, the unstated and the stated, and we get a very interesting one. However, I want to point out to you something that we would call, as C.S. Lewis says, modern literature in the New Testament, because the New Testament Gospels are the first modern pieces of literature. They're histories, but they're literature because they include dialogue and narrative together, which you had never found in history in many documents. There are a few documents that kind of look like it, but not so much. They're the first documents in history to put dialogue and narrative together, as C.S. Lewis wrote. Now, the previous proof conclusions, I didn't write them all up there, but I put in the ones for the newest thing. We said the unstated telos in Jesus Christ equals the logical argument that equals God. That's that whole thing about the word, etc. We had unstated logos taking hold of Jesus Christ equals the child of God. That was the end point. And finally, we had the one with Christ in John. The pneuma of God came down in Christ and remained. That's an unstated telos, because the stated telos, there are two stated teloses that John does, and I'm going to explain something about this. Number one, that will immerse the pneuma of God, that's the stated telos, and Jesus Christ equals the offspring of God, which equals God, which is the stated telos. We find that in the translation. You can also pick it out of your, you pick it. It's right in the Greek, but you can pick it out of your translation. The second one is this. This is the end part, and the part that we have just talked about just recently. One is Jesus Christ equals the sacrificial Lamb of God. And number two, we talked about this last week, Jesus convinced his disciples through a logical argument. I thought it was really funny. We have that hymn that we sang today about Jesus calling the disciples. But you know that Jesus didn't call the disciples kind of the way that it says in English, right? It says specifically in the Greek that he convinced them of a logical argument. He convinced them. So they followed him. So who knows who else he talked to that didn't follow him, right? So it wasn't like magic, and the hymn kind of gives you that impression. Oh, come on, dude, right? Which is kind of interesting, right? It's a very, I don't know why I know why I've done it. We try to translate word for word, and some of our words don't match in the Greek very well. But the final one is Jesus equals the offspring of God and the sovereign of Israel. And I don't think I left it in here. Did I leave it in here? Oh, yeah, it's in here. We'll see it in 149. The big deal here is, okay, in a Greek logos to telos, all Greek is a logos to telos, a logical argument to a unstated telos is what we usually have. But what gave John, right? We don't see many stated teloses. A telos is a conclusion. So, or telos is not exactly a conclusion. A telos, I'll remind you, a telos is like literally in Greek, a telos is the vanishing point on the horizon, because Greek is really geometric. So all Greek is geometric. A logos is a logical argument to a logical argument presented. But a telos is the vanishing point. So therefore, the logical argument causes, in a geometric sense, in a Greek sense, the vanishing point. So in other words, when you hear the logical argument, you put it all together, you get to a single point, right? And literally a parabola, a parable, is a logos, a logical argument with a singular telos. That's what we know from Greek. We have the other things, abalos, diabolos, which is really mistranslated, means a logical argument with no conclusion. And a hyperbole, right? Hyperbole, which means a logical argument with infinite conclusions, which is also to a degree kind of illogical. In any case, a logos to a telos. Now, how in a Greek sense, this is a very difficult question, very advanced question, but how in a Greek sense could I write in such a way that I state an unstated telos?
But they're all unstated, aren't they?
Yeah, but there's a trick. I'm using a trick, and it's a modern literary trick. In modern literature, we say, don't tell, only show. So how can I state a conclusion in a modern piece of literature? Or how can I state something that should be unstated in a modern piece of literature if I don't tell? How do I show it?
You describe it.
I can describe it. That is a good method. However, if I describe it, I'm telling, right? So, like, for example, let's say your protagonist is mean. So I could say, John was a mean person, right? That's telling.
Conversation will show a lot about a character.
Dialogue. That is correct. So what you get, especially in John, you notice who says the unstated teloses or the stated teloses? Who says it? In every case of the stated telos, John, the immerser, says the stated telos that Jesus Christ is the offspring of God and equals God. That's the stated telos. He says, he will immerse in the pneuma of God. That's what John says. And now we're going to get another one that says Jesus is the offspring of God and the sovereign of Israel, which we will get to. It's stated through the dialogue. So do you see? If I have okay, and you'll say, yeah, but the Greek dialogues don't ever state a telos. Yeah, that's the pure Greek, right? They don't ever tell you. Like the Socratic dialogues, for example, or the other dialogues that we find in Greek literature, all the philosophical dialogues. You'll almost never find a stated telos, even though they're dialogues. But what are they? They're really narratives. They're narratives that are, they're pure dialogues with no narrative. That's the problem, right? So you don't know what their context is. But in any case, the Greeks did not like to do this. John gives it to us, and that again points to John as being more Roman. Yeah, he's Greek, writing in Greek, great Greek, but more Roman even than Hebrew or Greek, which I think is really important to see. Because weans are Roman thinkers, really. We are supposed to be Greek thinkers, but we're Roman thinkers, right? Why? How do you know you're a Roman thinker? You see a problem and you
engineer it.
Yeah, you want to solve it, right? You see a problem, you want to solve it. If you can't solve it, you hire somebody. But it's like, what's his name? Dagwood, right? Dagwood Bumstead, right? What? Every time he has a plumbing problem, what does he do? He gets out his plumber's wrench and tries to fix it, makes it worse, and then he finally decides to call the plumber. That's a Latin. That is a Roman mindset. How about the Greek? What's a Greek mindset? Yeah, we're going to talk about it, right? So you talk about it, you'll never hire the plumber, then the plumber will never come, and your pipes will never get fixed. But you talked about it, right? And you may not, if it's an unstated telos, you're expecting what? Your wife, somebody's expecting somebody to call the plumber, but nobody does, right?
Well, we also want conclusions. We want to be told the punchline.
We do. We want conclusions, but that's our Roman, right? The Roman thinking and English thinking. It's not really romantic thinking per se, but from the Latin, from the Roman ideas, we want intro body conclusion, which we know Greek literature is not. It's logos to telos. Hebrew literature is not. It's synopsis body. That's a whole other thing, right? So what I did is I wrote that down, but let's look at the Greek, because that's what it's all about, right? Let's see. Magic. I push the right button? I push this button. Magic buttons. There we go. So we're at 148, and if you remember, I love this whole section. I guess I have to remind you because I think this is so funny. So this is where Nathaniel says, "Can anyone good come out of Bethlehem? Can anyone good come out of Bethlehem?"
Nazareth.
Oh, Nazareth. I'm sorry, Nazareth. And Jesus stared at Nathanael coming toward him and makes a logical argument concerning him. You look here, a not false Israelite in whom is no bait. So he said, I thought Pat was great. He said, this dog can't hunt. He was making fun of Nathanael, but he's the first guy in the group that has a true Israeli or Hebrew name. Everybody else has Greek names, which is really funny. So it said, how do you know me? Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Now here's the Greek. If you want to study it, you can. I've got it parsed here for you. Here's the King James. Nathanael saith unto him, whence knowest thou me? Jesus answered and said unto him, before Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw it. The reason I'll repeat, the reason I like the King James is because it's closer to the Greek word order in general, and it tends to be a better word for word. That's the reason I throw it up here. It's Old English, so it doesn't please us. But here is this literally translated word for word. So legea, he makes a logical argument to him, Nathanael, both in from what or which place, state, source, or cause, me is same in me, Greek, aparthe, he concluded for himself, Jesus, and he said to him, for the you, Philippon, emitting a sound, being under a fig tree, I saw you. Okay, so here's a direct translation in the Greek, putting it into a normal word order with the proper tense together in English. Nathan makes a logical argument to him, from which source do you know me? Jesus concluded for himself and said to him, before Philip made a sound to you under the fig tree, I saw you. Okay, I mean, this is really cool stuff. There's an unstated telos in here I didn't even need to mention. Can you guess what it is?
I'm God. I see everything.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an interesting implied condition here, because how can you see him unless you have super micro, macro, or you've got ring cameras everywhere? I'm just saying. I think this is a beautiful unstated telos in the Greek, because it doesn't go on to give us this whole big conclusion. Oh, Jesus is God. Why doesn't it need to say that?
It's pretty thoroughly implied.
Yeah.
Well, and also this unstated telos is already, I gave it to you right there, right? That Jesus Christ equals a logical argument which equals God. That's what John proved, a proof text from the beginning. So what's he doing? Do you see what he's doing logically? He gave us a proof text, and now what is he doing?
He's supporting it.
Yeah, he's using it. He's supporting it and using it and showing you. And we see this continually because, well, this gospel, and I talked about it right in the beginning, 24 classes ago, they call this gospel the signs gospel, the Simeon gospel. And the reason is because the point is to lay out the logical arguments and then do what? Support it with proof. And the proof are the sneon, the signs. Now, this is not called a sign, but what is it? Well, let's see what else it says. This is really interesting because his response is, then Daniel declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. That's a pretty declarative statement. Here's Greek. If we need to, we can go back to Greek if we need something to look at. Nathanael answered, said unto him, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God, the King of Israel. Here's the literal. He concluded for himself to him, Nathanael, Rabbi, you are the offspring of the God. Basileus, a king, a ruler, a sovereign, are of Israel. And here's the identity form, which I told you, that is an indicator of more of the Roman than it is of the Greek. We do not see identity form used very much in Greek. If you remember, I know you don't remember as well, but going back to Mark and Matthew, when we looked at Mark and Matthew, the identity form, and by the way, all the letters of Paul, almost zero use of identity form. In English, by the way, what are you supposed to get rid of in English if you can? Where's Jan? Jan's our expert on literature. But in literature, what should you get rid of in your writing, in your fiction writing, or even your technical writing if you can? What do they want you to do? You replace the identity verbs, is and are and was, with what kind of verbs?
Action verbs.
Yeah, active action verbs. Yeah, you were listening in your grammar classes. This is absolutely true. So instead of, you say he ran, or he talked, or, is, or she, we use identity to identify features or things about people, but in ancient societies they did. So when you start seeing identity verbs, you are really getting into the Roman, Latin, Romantic, and basically modern kind of writing. And so we see that in John, which, I'll point it out, that's why I put him in bold, because I think it's very interesting. Here's a translation. Nathanael concluded for himself to him, Rabbi, you are the offspring of God. You are a ruler, or a king or ruler, sovereign of Israel. Okay. You see what they did? The author just gave us a stated telos. In whose words? Nathanael's words. So Nathanael concluded, and I think it's really interesting. I look, apkrinthe is translated almost always as answered, but that's not what it means in Greek. That's why I leave it in the Greek form. He concluded for himself. Because if I just answer, right? Your mom says, pick up your clothes. And you go, yeah, sure, right? Did you conclude for yourself? No, because then she'll smack you, right? Because you need to pick up your clothes. Or your wife tells you to do something. Or ladies, your husband maybe asks you to do something, I hope. But if you ignore it, right? You can just answer, yeah, sure, right? But you didn't conclude for yourself. Concluding for yourself means you actually thought about it. Just like we saw with Jesus. Jesus didn't just say, hey, follow me, right? It says Jesus gave them a logical argument. And obviously they followed because they were convinced of the logical argument. In this case, Nathanael concluded for himself, and I wrote it down, something that's really important, and we saw this before. We already saw this. He calls him a rabbi. Why is that unusual? Remember from last time or a few times ago?
Because he doesn't have a synagogue.
Well, see, that's a great question. To be a rabbi, you pretty much have to be what? Pharisee. You have to be a ruler of a synagogue. What does this connote? If I'm calling you a rabbi,
Don't you have groups of students?
how many do you have to have? To have a Jewish synagogue, you have to have, you have 5 or 10? What's the number? 10 men, right? So to be a rabbi, you really have to have 10 people under your instruction. So for him to say that as that term, this is a technical term. Even in this period, it's a technical term. It means that he is, well, the synagogue is a very specific thing. Even in, by the way, synagogue is what kind of word? Is it a Hebrew word?
Greek.
It's total Greek. It means a led group. Because Greek has like about 10 or 12 words for grouping, getting people together. One of them is synagogue. And synagogue happens to be appropriated by Jewish thought and appropriated, which is really cool. That's neat, but it's a Greek appropriation of a Greek. It's an appropriation of a Greek word meaning a led group, and the led group is led by a rabbi. So this would imply that how many disciples are there right now?
Yeah.
At least 10. At least 10. And that, does that make Jesus necessarily a Pharisee? No, not necessarily a Pharisee. But it's very interesting that you even see later, we will see in chapter 3, that Jesus is called rabbi by a Pharisee. Yes, sir.
I guess what caught me off guard on this one is you are the king of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a leap, unless Nathaniel is saying you're the Messiah.
You are precisely correct. That is one of the stated telos here, because in we went back. I won't go back all the way, but if you look back in your notes, right before this, John in talking to his disciples said, "Behold Jesus," or "Behold this guy, the sacrificial Lamb of God." Right? So he's a sacrificial Lamb of God. He also said that he is God. Unstated telos in there. And then Jesus convinced them, convinced them about they even said, he convinced us about what Moses and the foretellers had said, right? So this is, if you have your apocryphal background or you have your modern Christian background, you're probably okay. The point is that they're pulling from that idea that if he is the high priest and the king, therefore he is the anointed one. What does John keep calling this guy? The Christ, the anointed one, right? So if he is the anointed one, that means he is Son of God. I like to say offspring of God because that's what the word means. But offspring of God and the king, which means if he is the king and high priest, he had sacrifice in there too, then what is he? He's the Messiah. He's the anointed one, which, by the way, he's called that, right, throughout, as Christ. Christ means the anointed one. It's a Greek term. So, and in, what's the Hebrew term? Messiah. Messiah means the anointed one, same thing. So anyway, but this is a stated telos, and how did our author get away with it from the literary critics of his time in Greek? He put it in the mouth of a person as a dialogue. Very interesting. It's a trick. It's a great trick. We do it in writing all the time. Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under a fig tree." This is unstated too. Somebody already said it. If you said, "I saw you under a fig tree," what does that mean? You said it. He's got to be God, right? I mean, unless he has ring cameras, like I said. So he's got to be God. Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said unto you, I saw you under a fig tree, believest thou, you shall see greater things than these." Okay, so what did it say in the Greek? He concluded for himself, Jesus concluded for himself, and said to him, "That are because I said to you, that are because I stared at you down under the fig tree. You are persuaded, large or great of these you will stare at." Okay, so in Greek, this is put into English Jesus concluded for himself and said to him, because I said to you that I stared at you down under the fig tree, you are persuaded. Greater than this will you stare at. In other words, greater than this you will not just mentally put together, but you will see. Yeah. That's why I love, like I said, I like to leave in the Greek so that we get the feel of what these people are really saying and what John is trying to tell us or write for us. I think this is a really interesting word. I'll mention it. I probably should have made it a word of the day, but I gave you the logical stuff. But pisteo is our word that we translate. Pisteo is belief, where pistis is faith. One is a noun and one is a verb. But in Greek, there is no word for faith and there is no word for belief. Not even one. The word pisteo means to be persuaded by a logical argument. So when we talk about faith and belief, we're not talking Greek. We're talking Anglo-Saxon, which is truly has permeated even our religious ideas. But there's a huge, well, not a huge, I think there's a big difference between being persuaded. Okay, if you have faith, you might not have enough faith, right? But if I'm persuaded,
It's an on-off switch.
yeah, it's on off. I'm persuaded. I don't need to have more faith, right? That's silly. So, if I'm convinced, it's not, I'm not convinced enough, right? I'm convinced. I've made my decision. I'm in. I'm all in. So I'm into the Greek, okay? Our Anglo-Saxons and even the Latin, I think a lot of it comes from the Latin and the Anglo-Saxon definitely, because of the words we've used to try to translate stuff. Greeks were not into, yes, the Greeks have their supernatural stuff, but they don't believe it. It's just part of their culture, right? Even they say themselves, read the Socratic dialogues, and you wonder if the priests are really trying to defend their own gods. Just you roll your eyes, you go, oh, poor Socrates. It almost seems like the modern arguments of today, right? Whatever, cracks you up. Anyway, then he added, truly, truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man, which is a very interesting statement. He said, "Then very rarely I say to you, after you shall see heaven open, the angels of God descending and descending upon the Son of Man." Kai, and he makes a logical argument to him. Firm, amen. We'll talk about it in a second. I make a logical argument to you. You will stare at the sky, dwelling place of the gods, but not of God, open up, and the message bringers of Theo, of God, going up and coming down on or against the offspring of the anthropo, of the man-faced human man. Okay, so here's a translation, literal or the translation put into English order. He makes a logical argument to him, firm. I make a logical argument to you, plural. You, plural, will stare at the sky, the dwelling place of the gods, but not of God. Open up, and message bringers of the God going up and coming down, descending on the offspring of the man face. I left man face, the offspring of the man. Okay. What's really important about this, it's really interesting. This is a Torah allusion. We'll see the allusion in a second. But some very interesting points to be made just by this statement itself. Number one, amen means literally firm. It's an exclamation. In English, we have exclamations too. In French, if anybody study French, tout à l'heure, right? Zut, right? Zut, tout à l'heure. They have all kinds of really cool, there's a whole list of them. In English, we do too. We just don't talk about them much, right? In Greek, they do too. They have a whole bunch of words that they're not meaningless, They have great meaning, but they're cultural, and many of them are very specific to things. So in English, in Greek, amen literally means firm. You know, we usually translate just amen because, you know, amen, right? Truly, truly, truly is usually the way it's used, but it's not really what it is. I can't remember what they call that form, but interrogative, emphatic.
Declarative.
Well, I think they call it emphatic because you always put a exclamation point after them. You know, zoot in French, for example. But you know, they're parts of speech in a language, and we see them occasionally. It means basically when you see it, this is supposed to be a telos. Okay, a stated telos. You notice Jesus almost never gives us a true stated telos, right? What is this? It's an allusion to the Torah. The only way you can understand this is really from the allusion in the Torah. So what he gave you, it's really funny. And I think we don't get enough of the comedy in the Greek. There is great comedy. There is great, the Greeks really like witticisms. They like, you know, figures of speech. They like turns of phrase. And so when Jesus says, firm, firm, and then he doesn't give you a stated telos, he basically gives you a Torah allusion. What is that? Right? It's supposed to make you think. It's supposed to make your brain start to churn and figure out where it came from, number one. And remember, whenever he said this, this quote comes from not the Hebrew, it comes from the Septuagint, right? LXX. This is a direct quote out of the Septuagint. It's a Torah allusion. It's not a direct quote, I'm sorry. It is a Torah allusion, but the words used come right out of the Septuagint. If I grab the Septuagint text in Greek, you go, wow, parallel. Because every single person pretty much that Jesus was speaking to, what have they done? They memorized the Torah, and they had memorized, most likely, if they're Greek speakers, the Septuagint. Because the Septuagint is, okay, you memorize the Torah, why? You want to get to your bar mitzvah, right? Because if you don't, then everybody will make fun of you for the rest of your life. So you memorize the Torah as you're required. The first 5 books, you memorize them as a Jewish boy, period. So to get to your bar mitzvah, you got to. But what did you do for fun? Look, they didn't have any of Green Gables. They didn't have Treasure Island. They didn't have all the great books you could read. So what did they read, if they could? Greek. And what did you have for Greek? Septuagint. And who do you think had it? Now, today you can't. If you're a rabbi in a synagogue, it's not illegal, but what can you only read from in the synagogue? The Hebrew document. Matter of fact, no pointlets, no separation. It's got to be the Hebrew scroll, period, dot. But back in this day, before they kind of came down with a sledgehammer, what did they do? They had Septuagint scrolls. Why not? Right? Because everybody's speaking Greek. Why not memorize and learn the Greek? Because it's a lot easier to talk Greek. Well, what's the problem with speaking Hebrew? It's dead. It's a dead language at this time. It is completely a deader than a doornail language. What language, if they're speaking, not speaking Greek, what are they speaking? Aramaic, which is not the same language. They have some similarities, but they're not the same. And so the problem you get is what you read in the Torah, what you read in the synagogue, you could not even speak to other people about. Now, we don't know what language that the rabbis used mostly in the synagogues, but I would guess it was mostly Greek. And I bet you, okay, picture this. You're the student. You're in the synagogue. You're a kid. You're a boy, and you're learning. You're memorizing the Torah. What do you think the rabbi does to explain the Torah to you, if he does at all? What's he going to explain it to you with?
Greek.
He's going to use the Greek. And what's he going to do? He's going to pull down his Septuagint, and he'll say, and you go, what does this mean? And he goes, well, in the Greek it says, in the beginning God, and God created, right? In Greek, he'll say that. And you'll go as a kid, oh, I get it, right? You got to realize this is a very interesting situation we find ourselves in this culture. This would be like, well, we don't have this experience. We could have. Back, what did they teach in the schools to every kid? Latin, Greek, their own language, a few other foreign tongues. You speak a lot of stuff, right? In Britain, they still do that. So if you do Latin, you do a dead language. Fortunately, in Latin, what is the positive about Latin that makes it a positive, even though it's a dead language?
All Romance languages are based on it.
Well, yeah, and you can speak it, right? So if you were in a Latin class, if you were in a class, not just a Latin class, because your teacher in the old days, 150 years ago, your teacher might say, toss you a Latin text, right? And tell you to learn it and read it. And as a student, you'd go, oh, that's hard, but you do it, right? Because you could. But the thing that they gave it to you, then you could speak to them in Latin. Remember? Do you remember reading all the Victorian literature? And what did the doctors and the lawyers and everybody speak? Latin, right? The common people knew what it meant-ish, but never could speak it correctly, but they all spoke it. Because even though it was a dead language, it was not a changing language. It could be used. Unfortunately, Hebrew was spoken, but it was a dead language that was only read and spoken. It was memorized. So you couldn't use it to discuss subjects. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Mishnah is in Hebrew. The Talmud, all the commentary, well, it starts out in Aramaic, and then it ends up in French, German. I think there's some Latin in there. I think there's some Greek in there, too. I can't remember. But it goes, there's other languages they use to discuss the Mishnah and the Talmud. Anyway.
For hundreds of years, Latin was the language that was used to write British legal documents.
Correct. Yes. And after that, what did they use? The language of the court and the language of diplomacy, French. That's correct. It's very interesting. Anyone read Tolstoy in the original language? You better know too. Why? Tolstoy always wrote in French and in Russian. And most of his dialogue is in French because all of his people are nobility. And the nobility, the Russian nobility all spoke French. And the big deal, you don't know this, but you should. Robin Hood, Little John. Robin Hood. Robin Hood, Little John. What did Robin Hood, what is the big fight in Robin Hood?
Property.
Normans.
The Normans. The Normans were?
French.
French. What did they speak? French.
French.
What did Robin Hood and Little John and all his buddies speak? Anglo-Saxon. This is a great fight they never tell you about. That was like through the history books forever. The big fight was the Normans, the Norman French, who took over the country in 1066. And in 1190, whatever, that period, 95, that was King. They would still have problems 1,000 years later. They were still fighting the war because the Anglo-Saxons were being subverted by the Normans, which is a great story. And we get Robin Hood and Little John running through the forest. We really need a little bit more. But anyway, what's really powerful about this is languages determine a lot. And that's why it's great to look at translation. So that's a great segue. The other thing he says here, okay, I make a logical argument, you will stare at the sky. Now the word here is arana. It's translated heaven, but even in our hymn, I think it's a sermon hymn today, the sermon hymn talked about from the sky, not from the above the sky. What's the difference? I should draw my picture. We see in Hebrews, remember in Hebrews, we'll also see it, we saw it once in John, we'll see it more, the Epiuranos versus the Uranos. What's the Uranos?
Cosmos.
Yeah, the Uranos is the created universe. Where does God live?
Outside.
In the Epiuranos, outside of that. So when you see Epiuranos, it means where God is, outside of the creation. Because God created, and that goes back to the Greek worldview. If I gave my Greek worldview picture, I guess that's what we're drawing on the board. If this will work. Sometimes these don't work very well. So I have the plenum of everything. And within the plenum of everything, of course, God is all, everywhere. He's in the plenum of everything. And God, actually said Jesus Christ, created the cosmos. This is Greek worldview, cosmos. And within the cosmos, I have the philosophia. Philosophia. Philosophia is what man can know. And then within the philosophy, I have the gay. The gay is the physical world. So, to be most specific, the Uranos is within the gay. The Epiuranos is outside of the creation. So this is an indicator. This is why I kind of get irritated about our authors, because if I say heaven, of course in English, if I say heaven, you also imply that it's the sky, right? But the word in Greek does not mean heaven at all. It means the sky. It means the part of, it's within creation. Now, in Greek thought, the gods did live in the Oranon. Because, okay, in Greek thought, and you need to keep this in mind because we're going to see it later. We'll see it. You see it in the Gospels. Who is the messengers of the gods in Greek thought? Birds. Yeah. Birds are the messengers of the gods. And so the birds fly into the sky bringing messages and information to the gods, because the Greek gods are not omnipotent or omnipresent. They are, Zeus. Zeus is sitting there on his throne, picking his nose, doing whatever, right? And that's the Greek worldview. So how does he get his information? The birds, right? The birds have his ring videos, but they're birds. So anyway, that is really important, because it's a discernment that we don't usually make in Greek or in English in our translations. We just say, okay, heaven open. It fits because it does fit within the context of the Torah allusion that we'll see. But I specify it's the only place of the gods, but not of God. God is in the Epiuranos. We saw that at the beginning, where it talks about Jesus, not coming from the sky. Jesus coming from the Epiuranos and above. Open up, and the message bringers. The reason I use message bringers is because the word angelos, all right, we've turned it into a supernatural word. It's angels, right? It's got to be angels. Angelos? Angels. What does it mean in Greek?
Sent messenger.
Message bringer. Yeah. It does not mean angel. If it were an angel, what would it probably say in Greek? It's interesting that it says message bringers of the Theo of God. That's probably pretty close. So a message bringer of God. However, the problem with that is a message bringer of God could also be, yeah, right. I could be bringing you, okay, if I'm bringing you a message of God, from God, now, it does tell us that the sky, okay, so above, but you notice what it doesn't say, that the Greek would say. Yes, sir?
Just thinking it's interesting in our present culture how when we think of angels, we want to make them bird-like. We put wings on them like birds, which is kind of the Greek association, going back to that again. So.
Precisely. And what I would say is if the author is giving us a Torah allusion. So, yes, these are message bringers of God. Are they angels? It could be. But you know what? That's a step. If they really were, if I were talking to a Greek audience and I was going to talk about it, I would say, bird-like, or I would say the bird whatever, right? Or the flying, messengers of God, to make it very specific. But because it's not specific, although this is a Torah allusion, so the allusion itself will help us, but even in the Hebrew, it's not necessarily angels. The word used, and I didn't parse those words, but the words used are message bringers. The reason this is important is because we turn wonderful concrete Greek into spiritualism. And I'm not against the idea of angels. That's cool. Angels are there. They are. But are you more likely to meet an evangelist that is bringing the message to you in a human form or an angel? Just saying, okay? I mean, there are people, St. Teresa of Avila, Edward, the American, that people have said they've seen angels and been directly talked to by God. I haven't had that experience yet, and maybe it'll happen. Most of us have not, It's not to say that it couldn't happen, but most likely, okay, yes.
I was just thinking about I think our minds just go back to symbolism through history, because if you look at art, how did they depict an individual in a painting that they were from God or from another world? The symbolism was wings.
Or halo, right?
A halo, not necessarily an angel, could be, but the halo represented a holy person of God because it had that glow. Like certain colors that they would paint Mary, or they would paint Jesus in. These certain colors represented or symbolized somebody righteous, someone holy, someone pure. So at that time, when we look at all the old paintings from long ago, they knew when they were hung that, oh, this has to be the mother of Jesus, because look what she's wearing, look at the halo. This must be, Gabriel that sent her the message, because he not only has, looks holy, but he has wings, which means he came from another place, another world from up above, which goes back to the birds, the symbol of the birds in the air. How else would you communicate? Because most people could not read. So symbolism was very important, especially with spreading the gospel, because it was a lot of symbolism, a lot of pictures.
I agree 100%. As a matter of fact, you might ask yourself the question. It's a beautiful question to ask based on what you said. Okay, I believe that God picked Greek on purpose. He picked the time, the place, and the language, because Greek is super concrete. Why do you think he picked Latin, and maybe even English later, to be one of the main languages to transport the gospel?
It's based on a lot of different languages. Even the Catholic Church, for hundreds of years, even I think up until the 50s, they may have maybe 60s, the Mass was read in Latin.
Yep.
It didn't matter where you were in the world, what language you spoke, they had one common language, which was Latin.
Well, I think the point is, and you're making the point, it's symbol. That in English and Latin are both very euphemistic. And so where Greek is super concrete, Latin and English tend to be very euphemistic. And so, and by the way, all the Anglo-Saxon and Latin languages tend to be very euphemistic, where Greek is not. And so I get a Greek source that is really, really concrete, and then I can put these beautiful pictures at which I can, and by the way, a picture can transport the gospel to different cultures, right? Yeah, without having to, it's interesting that the Japanese have angels and they have wings, right? I mean, that's kind of almost every culture. It's Tertullian. Remember Tertullian? Tertullian wrote his whole thing about how other cultures copy religious symbols from Christianity, from God, because they are God's symbols. I think it's very interesting. Anyway, going up and coming down. Okay, so let's see. What's a Torah allusion? Torah allusion is Genesis 28. Jacob left Beersheba, set out for Haran, and when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head, lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God, and by the way, this word in Greek is whatever the message bringers of God were descending and ascending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. And it goes on, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and the east, north and south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Okay. That is a statement. That is an unstated telos from Christ. And he just said that he is God. Because the only way that it says the Lord God is standing at the top of the stairway. So the only way that he could bring that to the disciples and Nathanael is if he is God. So this is a beautiful unstated telos. It's very interesting how most of Jesus' words are that way. We can move on in. I don't have a super long time, but here's 2 John. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. This is really interesting in the Greek. And the third day, because I already did the synopsis we had for him. The third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And to the Hemera, to a period of the day, Hemera means a period, but translated generally a day, a period of day and night, light and day. To the third Gamos, the wedding was caused to be in Cana of the Galileans of Galilee, and was the mother of Jesus in that place, the mother of Jesus. And on the third day was a wedding. Here's a translation. And the third day was a wedding in Cana of the Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was in that place. You notice what it doesn't say. Here's Cana in Galilee. You see that? Right here, there's Nazareth, Bethsaida, Cana. I'm going to talk, I guess we can start with this, about marriage, ancient marriage. First of all, I want you to really note, it says that the mother of Mary was there. What does it not say? Does it say she was invited? Does it say she's participating? Why might she be there? We'll learn more about this. I think it's interesting. Let's talk about ancient marriage a little bit. We need to get into that, but I think there's more in the Greek that will tell us. In ancient marriage, marriage is sex, sex is marriage. In the ancient world, once a man had sex with a woman, he was required to take her into his home. And if a man had sex with a woman, he was expected to pay the bride price, not necessarily money. Sex equaled marriage and made a man responsible for the woman and her offspring. So because of this, women were continually protected and men were very cautious. Because if you had sex with a woman, what did that mean in the community? You took the responsibility of that woman and her offspring. And so that was that. You didn't have much choice. Likewise, women were cautious because, you don't want a dupe ahead, right? There are three types of marriage, especially in Hebrew culture, but this is three types of marriage in the ancient world. We see this in the Old Testament very clearly. We also see it in the New Testament. But there's dowered, concubinage, and abandoned marriage. Legally, a woman at 12 with pubic hair could be married, and they would be married. Wealthy families generally would delay to 14. These are the typical ages in the ancient world. Both Egypt and Greece, we got good information from those societies that was generally the age. In Hebrew culture, a girl is a woman with pubic hair at 12, a boy at 13. A dowered marriage, if the family was wealthy or respected, there was a bride price. The bride price was to be sufficient to support the woman if the husband divorced or died. So in other words, the bride came with the bride price. It was a contract. So under Jewish law, for example, the bride price could be invested and could be, it had to be sequestered. In other words, it couldn't lose value. Because why?
Just in case something happens.
Yes, a surfeit. If the husband dies or divorces her, then she gets it all back. So guess what? What did the husband want to do? Not lose it. Because if you lose it, let's say your father-in-law, with the bride gave the bride price. So here's some land. Well, that's cool. But if the land doesn't produce, it's total waste, right? And if you don't improve the land and improve, this is a very interesting thing because we think of dowered marriage, we think of dowries and dowered marriage. Oh, that's just, some kind of silly thing they did in the past, right? No, it wasn't silly. It's very important. And most cultures did this. This is not unusual. There's alliance. The father might reduce the bride price, or the father might pitch in if it was important enough. The concept was that it was faith and honor. So, and maybe I said this wrong, but the man brought the goods. The husband, brought the goods to the family. And the bride price was, I'm giving this to you. I'm giving this to the bride, basically. And if something doesn't work out, the bride gets this. This is a surety. There's also a concept of faith and honor. You see it especially in Asian cultures, where they might reduce the bride price to other things like fealty, or providing soldiers, or providing weapons, or providing something that is not as tangible as land or goods, for the purpose of creating alliances and fealty. Yeah, you read about this. We tend to mess it up because we don't fully comprehend. We think that what dowry is just this just silly thing they did in the old days, right? No, this was the cohesion that kept cultures and societies together and allowed people to basically create governmental structures that we can't even imagine today, because we don't do this. We don't have, we generally don't have monarchies. We don't have serf-type. Thank God we don't have serf-like cultures. We're getting there.
It helps relationships stay. Like if you just paid a whole bunch of money, that's going to be sitting there. You don't want to lose that. Like you don't. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. It just seems like you've invested in something, so you're going to stick.
There you go. Like I said, we think that people were willy-nilly in the old days. They were not willy-nilly. They were really cohesive and understood what they were about. And their cultural traditions and the traditions they had were intended to create that cohesion in their culture. And that's part of the problem we have in modern cultures. We've lost a lot of those cohesive elements. Yeah, you say, okay, maybe I don't necessarily want dowered marriage, but yet you want the alliances, you want the ability to have that control. Ladies, wouldn't you love to have a bank account that your husband could not touch except to increase? And if he just said, hey, sayonara, that you'd have all the money you wanted to take care of your kids, right? I mean, that's pretty tough. Anyway, we'll continue with this next week. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.